Okay, we're going to begin this morning with a bit of a poll regarding this question. How many laws or rules are outlined in the Scripture? Okay, by show of hands, how many of you think that is 300? 300? Going once, going twice, okay? How many of you think it is 400? Any takers for 400? All right, we got some 400s. All right, how about 500? Any group think it's 500? All right. Go ahead now and turn to the person at your right, pat them on the shoulder. Go ahead, do it now, and say, that's all right, we're all wrong. It's actually 600. Can you imagine trying to remember, much less memorize, much less obey 600 laws? 600! Now, God must have understood how hard that might be, so God reduced it down to 10. You all remember the 10 Commandments? Passed those on to Moses and said, share those with the people. 10 is easier to remember than 600, but it's still a lot. So the Apostle Paul made it even easier to remember by writing to the church. The commandments of God are summarized in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. Now, memorizing one commandment might be easier than memorizing 600, but living out just this one commandment can be so very hard. Hence, the passage that we find in Matthew's Gospel this morning, even within the community of transformed believers, apparently it was hard to always be a people who lived in love. And apparently not much has changed over several thousand years. It's still very hard to always live in love. Now, here's another question for you to consider this morning. Have you ever noticed how it is that everybody who drives slower than you is an idiot, and everybody who drives faster than you is a maniac? It's a funny thing about us as human beings, the way we become the measuring stick for what is normal and what is right. The way I see things, the way I experience the world, the way I understand things, that's the normal way. That is the right way. And if everybody else would just do things the way I do it, well, all the world would be sweetness and light. And because this happens to be a part of our makeup as human beings, we keep on multiplying rules and laws to fit our conception, my conception, of what is right. Because loving my neighbor as myself is just really too hard. I mean, I grew up with the little verse of, well, I don't smoke and I don't chew and I don't go with the guys who do. And that was something I could remember. I could obey those rules and feel very righteous about myself at the very same time. But love my neighbor as myself, it's a lot easier for everyone else to act the way I want them to act. And that's what makes relationships so very complicated. Even our closest relationships are so hard. I remember reading about the man who went to visit with a young bride, a pastor. She had decided that she was going to have to call the wedding off because she was just so nervous about the thought of standing in front of all of the people in the church on a wedding day and speaking out loud. And so the pastor pulled her aside. He'd known her since she was a child, and he said, "Paula, you can do this. I mean, really, all you have to do is to remember 3 things. First of all, look there and remember that aisle. It's not a big deal walking down the aisle. You've done that hundreds of times. You walk down the aisle as an acolyte, bringing in the light of Christ. You walk down that aisle to greet your neighbors and to find your seat with your family. You walk down that aisle as an usher. Just remember the aisle. And remember this altar. How many times have you been here? Your parents carried you here for baptism. You stood here when you were confirmed. And how many times have you knelt here to receive Holy Communion? Remember the altar. And then remember him. John, he is a good guy. He loves you. He wants to spend his whole life with you. Just remember him. And she said, "You know, you're right, Pastor. I can do that. I can remember those things." And so the wedding day came, and the pastor was standing in the front and watching the bride come down the aisle. But with every step she took, he noticed that people were giggling, that people were beginning to laugh. And finally, when she got close to the front, he realized what was going on. With each step, she was reciting, "Aisle, altar, hymn. Aisle, altar, hymn." And isn't it true that even in our closest relationships, we have a tendency to want our own spouse, our parents, our children, our co-workers, if they would just do it my way, if they would just alter their ways. So the early church needed to figure out some guidelines based on their understanding of who Jesus was, on how to get along. Now, I have a hunch that a lot of times Christians in ages past, and probably Christians now, have used this particular passage as a kind of cop-out. We've used it to justify washing our hands of a friend or a family member who has wronged us or hurt us. We've looked at it as a list of everything I have to do before I can become properly vindictive. I've gone to see them, I've taken a friend, I've put it before the public's eye, and now I can dump you. But when you really consider the passage, rather than setting limits on our search for reconciliation, in other words, I've done enough, what this passage really implies, quite to the contrary, is that there are no limits. Try everything, never stop. If somebody sins against you, spare no effort in trying to make things right. Never apathetically tolerate a breach in a relationship. Now think about this text again. If your brother or your sister or your mother or your father or your friend sins against you, the first thing to do is to go and tell that person. In other words, put the complaint into words immediately instead of sitting around brooding over it, waiting. And brooding has the tendency to cloud the issue and to magnify and to intensify the problem. Brooding over a hurt can poison and color everything else that we might be able to think or say or do. It's like the man who went into a shop one morning and he was complaining about a fight he'd had with his wife. And he said, she got downright historical. And the shopkeeper said, don't you mean hysterical? And he said, no, I'm pretty sure it was historical. She was bringing up stuff I did 20 years ago. So the very first step in reconciliation is to go immediately and state what the problem is. Remembering that in going to the person and naming the offense, the purpose is not to condemn, not to humiliate, but to gain a brother, to gain a relationship. Now, if this effort fails, go again and take a wise person with you. And that does not mean take Aunt Tilly, who always agrees with you, and will join you in telling you, the other person, how terrible they always are. It says take a wise person with you, someone whose presence will offer calm and set the stage for a new atmosphere of dialogue and communication. It's like Miss Paris in one of the churches I served. Whenever I knew we were going to have a meeting at church that might be particularly contentious, or if I knew that personalities were really going to be out in full, I would go and pick up Miss Paris and bring her to be a part of the meeting, because she was one of those people who was just sweet. And she was kind, and she was gracious, and she was loving. And whenever she was in the room, it was just a whole lot harder to be ugly. Find a wise person like that to go with you. And if that doesn't prove helpful, take the offense before the fellowship. And that doesn't mean just any old fellowship, but the fellowship of the church at its very best, a fellowship that offers both parties Christian prayer, Christian love, Christian nurture, and it is within the bounds of this community that there may be hope for reconciliation. The scripture says then, if that doesn't help, if there is still no reconciliation, let him be to you like a Gentile or a tax collector. Now, at first glance, this sounds like words telling you that it's okay to give up now. It's okay to wash your hands of this situation. But think for just a moment, how did Jesus treat the Gentile and the tax collector? Remember, this whole account is in the Gospel of Matthew, as in Matthew, the tax collector. How did Jesus treat the Gentile and the tax collector? Jesus loved them. He ate with them. He offered good news to them. He never gave up on them. He gave his life to them. He gave his life up for them. It's no mistake that this passage follows directly on the heels of the parable of the lost sheep, where the shepherd goes and he leaves the 99 sheep in the pen and goes in fervent search for the one that is lost. Let him be as a Gentile or a tax collector is not an injunction for abandonment. It is an injunction to love. The message here is never give up. Never stop finding ways to love, knowing full well that it may be that you will never be able to gain a brother, or at least not in the way you might wish to, but in the searching and in the loving and in the trying, you may, by the very grace of God, gain yourself. It's very fitting that this whole instruction on reconciliation is concluded with the words that we find in verses 19 and 20. Again, truly I tell you that if two of you on earth agree about anything, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there am I with them. These words are a reminder that restoration of relationships can only come when set within the context of community. My personal prayer is important, but so often the most frequent word in my personal prayer happens to be me. But praying with another person forces me to center not simply on my need and my wants and my hurt, but also on the need of another. It forces me to think about not only my will, but the very will of God. There's a French proverb that goes, if we knew all, we would forgive all. Now, forgiveness is a tricky thing. Forgiveness is not saying forget it. Forgiveness is not saying I forget. Forgiveness is not saying it's okay. Rather, forgiveness is saying I'm okay. And I'm willing to let God be concerned about whether or not you're okay. Forgiveness is not saying I don't hurt anymore. Rather, forgiveness is saying I no longer feel the need to hold on to your involvement in my hurt. When we feel hurt by someone else, we need to experience prayer with another, prayer within community to remind us that we see but in part, and we understand but in part, we know only in part. But when we have a prayer like that is offered in my name, when it is offered in the very Spirit of Jesus, it is a way of saying that my prayer is offered in the very same way that Jesus would offer a prayer, and that is a different kind of praying. When you think about it, so often our prayers are prayers of escape from something, escape from illness, escape from circumstances, escape from hard times, escape from oppressive situation, but God never offers escape from. But God always promises victory through. And there's a real difference there. This was illustrated in Jesus' own experience in the Garden of Gethsemane when he prayed so fervently to be released from an obligation. Let this cup pass over me. But instead, Jesus was given power to meet it, to endure it, to conquer it. Prayer in the name of Christ means I can accept what I can never fully understand. I can endure what is unendurable. I can face what without Christ is beyond all facing. And when we stand as a community made strong by that kind of prayer, we become to God a special treasure. We become a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, a people who truly live for the sake of each other in the covenant of God's never failing and all-encompassing love. God, pray we can be that kind of people for the sake of each other and for the sake of the world.